Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to extend best wishes to my constituents, Duncan MacDonald and June MacDonald, who celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary on April the 9th. This couple has lived in various communities across Canada, from Vancouver to Toronto, then decided to land and take up residence here in Colby Village in 1984. Sorry. They are an exceptional couple, and they are living legacies in our community. And it was an honor to deliver a congratulatory certificate to this vibrant couple in person and say hello. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to wish them congratulations on their long marriage and many wishes for the future. Thank you.
We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, how gullible do they think we are? How gullible do they think Nova Scotians are, Mr. Speaker? For 2 years, everything was dark and stormy, Mr. Speaker, that things had to be cut, that people had to sacrifice. But, Mr. Speaker, all of a sudden today, we are supposed to believe that the heavens have opened and the sun is shining and money is going to rain down on the government in the months ahead. Mr. Speaker, that's what we're being told today. And you know what, Mr. Speaker, where have we heard that before? We heard it from the NDP, and the Liberal caucus was the first one to criticize them for inflating their revenue estimates by hundreds of millions of dollars, by proposing a health budget with no new money, Mr. Speaker, completely unrealistic. And now we have a new trick, $110 million one time coming from another government. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is pretty direct. How can Nova Scotians trust a budget that has such rosy scenarios in a one-time other government windfall?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to thank all Nova Scotians for the tremendous work they've been doing with our government over the last 2 years, Mr. Speaker. We've been able to move ourselves back, Mr. Speaker, to fiscal health. We know the job is not done. There's more work to be done. There's no one on this side of the House saying where the money is here, that pop the champagne corks, Mr. Speaker. There's a lot of work still ahead of us. We were very transparent with Nova Scotians when the $110 million arrived from two other governments, from the federal government and municipal government. We did what we believe Nova Scotians want any reasonable government to do, which is pay down the debt that's associated with that, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, the hard work that Nova Scotians have been doing to bring us back to fiscal health, we heard from Nova Scotians. They wanted us to invest in our children, Mr. Speaker. They wanted us to make sure our child care was more affordable. They wanted to make sure the classrooms were being funded properly. They wanted to make sure that people with disabilities in this province were treated with the respect they deserve, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank all Nova Scotians for continuing to work with us over the last number of years, and I want to thank them for continuing to work with us as we go forward to provide good government for the people of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it is no thanks to the people of Nova Scotia to present them with a budget that's based on such ridiculous, false information as we saw here today, Mr. Speaker. They know better. They've been down this road before, Mr. Speaker. They were prepared to trust this government when they came in, when they said that they would be good financial managers. They threw that away today, Mr. Speaker. Let's talk about $110 million that's supposed to be for the World Trade Center. Today, suddenly it has a new name. Mr. Speaker, it's called a contribution to fiscal capacity for provincial health complex. But it's for the World Trade Center, Mr. Speaker. It's so our kids don't have to pay for that building over the next 25 years. I'll ask the Premier, how can Nova Scotians trust a budget when it deliberately misdirects the money that was meant for the Trade Center?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to tell all Nova Scotians, the fact of the matter is this government borrowed money for the Trade Centre in partnership with our two other levels of government. The federal government and municipal government contributed back to us $110 million, Mr. Speaker. We did what I believe every Nova Scotian would expect us to do. We took that money, we paid down the debt associated with that, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, and that allows us to have capacity in our debt management, Mr. Speaker, to be able to invest in the new health complex, Mr. Speaker, across our province. Unlike other governments, Mr. Speaker, when they were given the choice, Mr. Speaker, to take that money and spend it or to do the right thing and put down debt, we did the right thing and paid down the debt, Mr. Speaker, so we can invest in the things Nova Scotians want us to invest.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians count on this government to be honest about what it is doing. That should be rule number one. They're spending that $110 million, Mr. Speaker, 4 times. Not once, but 4. It came from some other government. But in one day, we're told it's going to make this year look better. Oh, no, it's not. It's going to pay down debt. Oh, no, it's not. It's for the Trade Centre. Oh, no, it's not. It's for a new VG, Mr. Speaker. Well, which is it? You can't spend the same money 4 times. So I'll ask the Premier, how can Nova Scotians trust a budget that counts for the same money 4 different ways?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to tell you and tell all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, that money is accounted for once. The only thing that member has said, Mr. Speaker, that I understood this week is that his accounting rules are rusty.
The Honourable In-House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, in December, the government presented a doom and gloom budget forecast update prior to introducing Bill 148. Now, just a few short months later, the government is presenting a paper surplus as we move closer to an election. My question, Mr. Speaker, is for the Premier, and why does he continue to play short-term electoral politics despite pleas from our Nova Scotians to act differently?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that government had a choice when they were in power, Mr. Speaker, and they saddled up to the union bosses in this province, Mr. Speaker, to buy favour. What we made a decision was to do what Nova Scotians wanted us to do, Mr. Speaker, was to shore up services, invest in health care and home care, making sure the child care workers in this province are being remunerated properly, Mr. Speaker, making sure people with disabilities are being respected in this province, Mr. Speaker. We made choices. Governing is about choices, Mr. Speaker, and we're standing with the people of Nova Scotia, not the big union bosses.
The Honourable In-House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
I can point to. Mr. Speaker, this budget suggests the province is not in the dire financial situation the Premier has been suggesting for the last 2.5 years. This raises questions about the need for the government's meagre wage pattern offered to public sector workers. My question for the Premier is, given this updated fiscal outlook, will his government commit to negotiating a wage pattern with our public sector workers at the bargaining table?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I think if she'd been paying attention to what happened across this process, there wasn't a single person in the union across this province that disagreed with the wage pattern, Mr. Speaker. If you listen to the media scrums, you listen to what they say across this province, what they were looking for, Mr. Speaker, was continuing the conversation. They say we didn't negotiate long enough. They were okay with the wage pattern, Mr. Speaker. We're okay with it too. We're going to invest in those Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, that were forgotten about by that government.
The Honourable In-House Leader for the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we learned today that much of the projected surplus will be used to increase the province's fiscal capacity. However, the government is leading us to believe that this money is set aside for a new health complex. My question for the Premier is, what guarantee do Nova Scotians have that this money will be spent on the Nova Scotia Health Complex?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you, the honourable member, for the question. As I said, Mr. Speaker, that money that came from 2 other levels of government, the municipality and the federal government, was to go against the convention centre debt that this province had borrowed, Mr. Speaker. We had taken that money, did the right thing. We paid down that debt. We're paying down that debt, which gives us capacity, Mr. Speaker, to borrow money to do the much-needed health complex that Nova Scotians are telling us they want us to focus on.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the only thing getting rusty today is the Premier's credibility, and it's going downhill fast, Mr. Speaker. Robbing Peter to pay Paul is not an accounting policy. Mr. Speaker, taking money that was to relieve our kids of the burden of the World Trade Center, and using it this year to fund a new VG, which we'll see someday what that is, Mr. Speaker. That is rusty credibility, to say the least, Mr. Speaker. I'll ask the Premier very directly. Why not just honestly tell Nova Scotians that that $110 million is actually for the Trade Center and get on with a real plan for the VG?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I put my credibility against that members in the last election, and I'm prepared to do it the next one.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, that's quite an answer, Mr. Speaker. The people of Nova Scotia, they trusted this government when it came in, that they were serious. But that is gone now, Mr. Speaker. When a government brings in a budget like this based on such rosy scenarios that they know aren't going to happen, that takes $110 million that's supposed to be for one thing and uses it for something else, Mr. Speaker, that is not credible, it is not trustworthy, but that is what is happening today, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to ask the Premier, why doesn't he just do the right thing and bring us a VG that isn't paid for with somebody else's money?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, I want to assure the honourable member that we are doing absolutely the right thing, Mr. Speaker, by taking the money that was associated with the Trade Center, paying down the debt, Mr. Speaker, which provides us an opportunity to have debt capacity to invest, Mr. Speaker, in the health complex that Nova Scotians expected to do. Every other Nova Scotians understand the fact, Mr. Speaker, to pay down your credit card. Don't set aside a bunch of money, Mr. Low Interest. Pay down the debt, Mr. Speaker. Will give us capacity to be able to invest in the very things they want. The honourable member wants us to set aside money for a car a year in advance before we get it while we're being drowned by our own mortgage, Mr. Speaker. We decide to pay down our mortgage to make sure we can make that investment.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the second year in a row, the Minister of Health has frozen our provincial health spending. Across our province, ER closures are rampant, home care wait times are skyrocketing, mental health services are harder to access, and families can't find a family doctor, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, given these healthcare realities, how can the Minister justify freezing spending for the second year in a row in the Department of Health?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If the member opposite looked closely, he would see that there was quite a movement of monies from health and wellness into communities, culture and heritage. Also, money moved into the Provincial Health Authority. And if he had looked really close, he would have saw that we've invested an additional $38 million in the health budget.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But if the minister would keep speaking about what he's done in the health budget, Mr. Speaker, this year's budget, the minister cut $3.1 million for our province's nursing home, Mr. Speaker. We know the wait list has grown in Nova Scotia. There are seniors today waiting for placement for long-term care. So, Mr. Speaker, how can the minister justify cutting $3 million from nursing homes, giving our province's health needs, especially our seniors, looking for long-term care placement?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We can address many of those details during estimates on the budget. We made a commitment to move to a much stronger home care capacity, and the $14 million investment will go a long way to reduce those wait lists.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Speaker, the only thing the Premier should be thanking Nova Scotians for today is the amazing amount of new income tax he plans to collect from them if this budget is to be believed. Mr. Speaker, their own projections, which are so ridiculous, say they're going to get $140 million more out of income tax from the people of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, there's no hard work being done by the Liberals. It's the people of Nova Scotia they're calling on through more taxes this year. Mr. Speaker, of course, it's not going to happen. There aren't more people. They aren't making more in wages, Mr. Speaker. This is a ridiculous projection, Mr. Speaker. So how can Nova Scotians trust a budget that is based on the assumption they're going to pay $140 million more in income tax?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, one of the things that the honourable member and I can agree on is that we all should thank Nova Scotians for the tremendous work they're doing. Helping our government get back to fiscal health, Mr. Speaker. We have more work to do, telling us the things they want us to invest in, like childcare, Mr. Speaker, and classrooms across this province, investing in making sure that people with disabilities are treated with the respect they deserve, Mr. Speaker, working with small business owners to invest, to create more job opportunities, Mr. Speaker, as you would have heard in the speech from the budget speech. Youth employment is up in this province. Business confidence is at all-time high, and compared to Canada, Mr. Speaker, our population is at all-time high. Those are all positive signs. We're looking forward with employers to go out and hire those hard-working Nova Scotians to continue to build on our economy and to keep our confidence high.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, at this rate, the people of Nova Scotia, the taxpayers of Nova Scotia, can't afford to have this Premier keep thanking them by taking more of their tax dollars. Mr. Speaker, $140 million. The workforce is actually shrinking. That's what he seems to be missing, Mr. Speaker. Wages are not going up by that much. They were the first ones, the Liberal caucus, to criticize the NDP for making up these numbers. Now this government is doing the same thing, Mr. Speaker, so I'll ask the Premier, why did he choose a higher tax bill for Nova Scotians when they already pay so much in income tax?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. That's not at all what we did, Mr. Speaker. Tax rates are not changing in this province. We're continuing to make sure that Nova Scotians told us they wanted to shore up public services. We're going to continue to shore up those public services. Investing in Nova Scotians require those investments. You know, we have great examples across our region when governments decide they're going to follow the path of that particular leader by cutting and slashing taxes. And New Brunswick is battling with the very thing that happened under a former government. Newfoundland and Labrador introduced a budget, Mr. Speaker, $2 billion in debt after they slashed taxes, building their future on resource revenue. Nova Scotians want us to do the right thing, ensure that we invest in stable public services, at the same time providing a competitive environment for investment, for job growth, and allowing the public sector to drive that opportunity.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it turns out we do agree on something, because I absolutely would like to see some real tax relief for the families of Nova Scotia who pay the highest tax in the country, the highest income taxes, the highest sales taxes, in many cases the highest property taxes. But for every year into the future that this government looks forward in this budget, they're going to be stuck with the highest taxes in the country. No wonder the economy is stuck, Mr. Speaker. It's not a coincidence. On sales tax, they were supposed to believe that Nova Scotians, the same number of them with the same income, are going to pay magically $45 million more in HST. That dwarfs the tiny pretend surplus that the government's trying to put over on us, Mr. Speaker. How can Nova Scotians trust a budget that is based on them paying so much more in HST?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, because Nova Scotians are much more optimistic and confident than the leader of the Conservative Party.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
They're also not suckers, Mr. Speaker. They've seen this movie before. They saw it with the NDP. A government says there's no money for 2 years, then all of a sudden everything's better, Mr. Speaker, and they use these tax projections to make it look that way. But you and I know, Mr. Speaker, or maybe not you, but I think any reasonable person would know that that's not what's going to happen, Mr. Speaker. It's not what's going to happen. This is not right. Mr. Speaker, every Nova Scotian watching today knows exactly what's going on here. That a government that told them one thing for 2 years now is trying to get them to believe that everything is fine, that they're going to suddenly have another $40 million in HST to pay, another $100 million in income tax to pay to make the government look good. Well, it's not the case, Mr. Speaker. How can Nova Scotians trust a budget when it is based on such faulty assumptions?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I think you're a reasonable guy. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians have worked with this government over the last number of years to make very difficult choices. All those Nova Scotians are sharing in the pain, Mr. Speaker, that it's taken us to get back to fiscal health. No one on this side of the House said the job is done. We will require those Nova Scotians to continue to help us to get back to greater fiscal balance so that we can invest in the things, Mr. Speaker, that Nova Scotians told us that are important to them. Making sure child care is affordable, investing in classrooms across this province, providing people with disabilities the respect they deserve, Mr. Speaker, in this province, working with the private sector entrepreneurs to drive job opportunities, graduate to opportunities program. All of those things are positive, Mr. Speaker. I want to assure the honourable member, every member on this side of the House does not believe the job is done. We're going to continue to work with those optimistic Nova Scotians and continue to prove him wrong.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today's budget revealed that the Liberals plan to take another $27 million from Nova Scotians using VLT machines. It's wrong that the Liberals are targeting vulnerable Nova Scotians, and in opposition, the now Minister of Health said balancing the books on the backs of Nova Scotians' problem gamblers is not an economic strategy. And my question to the Minister responsible for Part 1 of the Gaming Control Act is, does this minister believe that balancing the budget on the backs of problem gamblers is an economic strategy?
Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, as the member would know, the decision was made to cancel the My Place system, which was clearly not working at addressing the issue of problem gambling. As a result of that, we have seen recreational gamblers return to playing the VLTs, which has brought the revenue up. I should point out to the member that if he goes back and looks historically, that even with the revenues today, they are still less than what was actually coming in as revenue prior to the My Place system.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think if you cancel the My Place system without a plan to help problem gamblers, which this government did in 2014, and then see revenues go up, it's probably not a surprise to anyone what might have been happening there. So since the cancellation of the My Play system, gambling revenues from VLTs have increased $38 million. And this government is banking on that to pick up another $27 million this year on top of that. So, well, if you make no change in investing in helping people gamble responsibly, then you should expect revenue to go up. So my question is, why is the minister okay with taking millions more from vulnerable Nova Scotians, but not providing support for problem gamblers?
The honourable minister responsible for the Gaming Act.
Mr. Speaker, as Nova Scotians would be aware, the VLTs that are in place now have a number of mechanisms on them to remind users of how long they've been playing and how much that they have inserted, safety mechanisms that didn't exist in the past. Those are there. Again, the My Place system was not working. There currently is no other software within Canada that has shown to have been able to address issues of problem gambling. Again, once the My Place system was removed, there was an expectation that there would be an increase in revenue, but I should point out again that the revenue today is still far less than what was being received prior to the My Place system being implemented.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Finance. In the budget, the personal income tax in the budget is estimated to increase by 4.1%. Now, to put that into context, quick math shows you that would mean 20,000 new jobs in Nova Scotia, or some pretty substantial pay increases, which obviously we all hope happen. Yet according to Statistics Canada, their latest data shows the province's labour force has dropped in every year, including last year, since 2012. Mr. Speaker, on what basis is the personal income tax estimated to increase when StatsCan says the labour force is declining and continues to do so?
The honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. The process by which we build our estimates and the forecasts that go into the budget process, Mr. Speaker, especially with respect to income tax projections, Mr. Speaker, relies on the information provided by the federal government. The federal government, Mr. Speaker, manages and administers the taxes, the income taxes, both personal and corporate, Mr. Speaker. They provided the updated information to us. We have an obligation to use the most recent data provided by them. We use the data that we had in place by late January to influence the forecast and the modelling we used in this budget.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the answer, and of course the data comes from elsewhere, but it's this minister's responsibility to ensure that it matches other data they have. And the data that the Department of Finance links to from Statistics Canada shows that although the unemployment rate has gone down, the actual labour participation in this province has decreased in every single year since 2012, which means there are less people working. And if you actually look at the average salaries in the province have gone down, so that the math doesn't work that you could then have more income tax revenue next year, and certainly not by the amount indicated. As I said, Mr. Speaker, some quick math shows that it would take about 20,000 new jobs to make up the difference between the estimate from last year and the estimate from this year. So, Mr. Speaker, what allowance is made in the budget if that number is incorrect.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, as with every budget, it's a forward-looking document, Mr. Speaker, based on the best information that we have available at the time when those documents are prepared. We bring our estimates and our assumptions, both for economic variables, Mr. Speaker, to experts from the private sector as well as academics to assess the reasonableness of the assumptions that we make. The Auditor General reviews our assumptions and our estimates, Mr. Speaker. So the provisions of the work that was done by the public servants who do the analysis on behalf of government, Mr. Speaker, was done and has passed the reasonableness test with, again, private sector, academic, as well as the Auditor General, Mr. Speaker. So we stand by the numbers that we have in our budget.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you to the Minister of Health. There were 17 recommendations to address gaps in the prescription drug monitoring program identified by the Auditor General in 2012, and only 13 of them have been followed. 4 years later, the AG has stated that he's not happy with the program's result, and I will table that. Noting the failure to implementing the remaining recommendations, the Auditor General said it wasn't done and we didn't think that was reasonable. So my question to the Minister is, in light of recent cases that have shown lapses in the prescription monitoring program, will the Minister explain why all of the recommendations proposed back in 2012 were not accepted?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. All of the recommendations were accepted, and if we take a look at those that have not been fully implemented to date, we'll see that 3 of those are directly related to IT, and the last contract is out, and that work will be completed in June.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's critically important that the access to prescription drugs is properly controlled and monitored. And we know in a recent case raised concerns almost 6 years ago. The Minister has indicated that we're heading for stronger legislation associated with this program. So my question to the Minister, will he table the legislation in this session to finally address the gaping holes in the system and help keep prescription drugs off the street?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for Minister of Health for a very timely and important question. As we now look at the PMP, I'm pleased to say that we'll be having an external review. That request has already gone out, and we need that review before we put together the legislation, and the goal is to have legislation for the fall sitting.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. As the Minister stated last week in question period, myself and fellow colleagues from Pictou Centre and Pictou East met with representatives from the Nova Scotia Health Authority. We were told that funds originally designated for the now non-existent mental health unit at the Aberdeen Regional Hospital have been reallocated to the Colchester East Hants Health Centre to increase their mental health beds from 10 to 14. Will the Minister stand in his place and confirm that money, which was originally designated for mental health services in Pictou County, has indeed been reallocated to the Colchester East Hants Health Centre?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think, as the member should understand from the information provided by Dr. Corey, we know that there's been increase in community capacity in Pictou. We know that it was an uncertified unit that was at the Aberdeen. It was not a true mental health unit, and we have the expertise at Colchester to provide for an area the very best treatment for trauma and acute mental health conditions.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
So, Mr. Speaker, since we know that money was originally designated for Pictou County residents, can the Minister confirm that the 4 extra beds being paid for by Pictou County residents and resources that should be going to their hospital will be used to service Pictou County residents in the event of their mental health crisis?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The practice of having, a resident go to another part of the province for the best of mental health services is nothing new. This has been a practice for many, many years, and it is a matter of placement that will be best suited for the patient at that particular time. What I do know is that there will be 2 new beds funded by the Nova Scotia Health Authority. When the emergency room is complete, there will be 2 mental health trauma observation beds that will be in place.
The Honourable In-House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that the Minister of Community Services has been making changes to the Child, Youth and Family Support Program. Today we see in the budget that at least 17 FTEs, of full-time equivalents, have been eliminated from that same program. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister explain how eliminating at least 17 FTEs will enhance services for children and their families?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. Over the past year, the Department of Community Services and, in fact, the Government of Nova Scotia have made extraordinary strides in strengthening families all across this province. We have invested over $1.2 million in Stronger Families Nova Scotia. We have increased parenting journeys from 12 to 27 sites across this province. We have piloted 2 new programs that have never been in Nova Scotia, and the investments that we've made are there to strengthen the families that are struggling in Nova Scotia with child welfare, and also the investments that we've made in income assistance, the highest increase, one-time increase in the history of the program, will in fact assist struggling families in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable In-House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask the Minister to check out her budget and look at page 6.5 and also 6.4. Not only has the Minister eliminated at least 17 FTEs from Child, Youth and Family Support, but she's also cut $1.4 million from frontline child welfare caseworkers. Mr. Speaker, less workers on the front lines means less services for our province's most vulnerable. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister justify cutting $1.4 million from frontline child welfare caseworkers?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Perhaps the member can do her homework. A lot of the transferring out of my department went into IT to other areas in the Nova Scotia government. Let me just say that when you are strengthening families with the investments that we've made, both legislatively through the changes that we made in the Child and Family Services Act, which had not been touched in 25 years, and the investments that we've made in communities across this province to strengthen families, those are the investments that are going to help families. Those are the investments that are going to prevent children from coming into care in the first place, which should be the goal for every government in this province.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, with the recent announcement of closures of schools in Cape Breton, it is recommended the closure of several schools on the north side, especially Thompson Middle School and Sydney Mines Middle School. Has the government considered the social and economic impact of these closures on the people and the businesses of North Sydney and Sydney Mines?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. And as I said last week, I commend the communities in Cape Breton and the families there who worked with their school board to make some very difficult decisions about the future of buildings in the board, recognizing that, and the member would know, that the decisions about school closures are made at the school board level, and the minister cannot reverse those decisions. But I do recognize the importance of communities working with their elected board members.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, a new middle school has been proposed to replace the 2 aged schools. Can the minister tell me what the status of that proposal is, and will serious consideration be given to where it will be constructed to ease some of the economic impact on the north side?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. I think sometimes people get confused with the two processes. One process about school review is a process that is fully conducted within the communities, and the decision that's made regarding those outcomes are decisions that are made by the elected school board members. What the member is talking about now is new capital construction projects, and the process for that is for boards to submit to the minister a list of new projects that they would like to have considered, and we will give serious consideration to all of those proposals.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, many Nova Scotians who work in the mining industry will be dismayed to hear that the Liberal government has once again failed to deliver on its promise to introduce a fuel tax rebate for the mining industry. The government promised to phase in the rebate starting in 2015. My question to the Minister, why isn't the Minister committed to finally honouring his government's promise to the mining industry by introducing this fuel rebate?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member for the question. This government and my department are totally committed to the mining industry in Nova Scotia, and we are currently have in front of the House a new Mineral Resources Act, which is going to overhaul our antiquated process that's been in place for this province for a long time. With regard to the fuel tax rebate, Mr. Speaker, we have told the House and the people of Nova Scotia that is under consideration, that when the time and our fiscal capacity is there that we can do this, we will do it. And thank you. And remember, check the price of diesel in this province, Mr. Speaker. There's a very considerable bonus to fuel tax in the province. Not that it's anything that this government has done, but it is a reality in excess of 40%. That's providing interim relief until we get to the point where we're physically able to give that rebate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia continues to rank last in Canada for attractiveness and for investment in mining. The request for this rebate from the industry is very reasonable, as similar rebates exist for other industries that do not make significant use of public roads. There is much more we can do beyond modernizing the MRA to help increase the attractiveness for investment in our mining industry. My question to the Minister, why does the Minister believe the industry should not have this important measure to grow and create jobs for Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, not to repeat myself, we're very aware of this important industry important industry to our province. We are looking forward to the Law Amendments Committee, Mr. Speaker, to get this new legislation which will help the industry through, and we fully intend to give the request from the industry with regard to fuel tax our full consideration. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question today is for the Minister of Business. The recent economic report by PricewaterhouseCoopers provides clear evidence that the film tax credit created great economic benefit to the province in 2014. 180 million in GDP, 3,200 jobs. However, this government chose to kill the tax credit and replace it with an incentive fund that has proved unworkable, partly due to the $10 million cap. So my question for the Minister, since today's budget confirms that this has not changed, does he plan on simplifying the application process for the industry, and how soon does he think changes could be made?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. One of the discussions that we continue to have with the film industry is, in fact, the application process itself. There's been challenges with that process. We believe that the administrators through NSBI now have a method there where they can see a turnaround in 2 to 3 weeks. That's the objective. We're looking for that level of service from NSBI, and I know NSBI is committed to making that mark.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you very much, and I really do appreciate that answer from the Minister. Mr. Speaker, my second question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, this government has provided a steady stream of hefty payroll rebates to major corporations and banks such as the RBC, TD and Butterfield, an offshore bank in Bermuda, while disrupting investments to the filmmaking industry despite its contribution to the province's prosperity at a return rate of 7-to-1, Mr. Speaker. So my question is, can the Premier explain why funds are freely provided to banks and other wealthy corporations such as Michelin and Clearwater, for instance, while the incentive fund for the filmmaking industry is mired in red tape and has this $10 million cap, which is almost impossible to use, so the whole industry is now on life support?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't agree with the honourable member in the premise of her question. We have made available to the industry a $10 million fund, Mr. Speaker, that is accessible. It is there for them to use. I encourage them to use it. We're very proud of the investments we've made in the rebate program that every government has used, Mr. Speaker. It's about 9 cents on the dollar, Mr. Speaker. Provides a positive return on taxation. It's related to the taxes that we collect, Mr. Speaker. Unlike the former film tax credit, which was a 65-cent grant subsidy out the door, Mr. Speaker, there's a big gap between 65 and 9, Mr. Speaker. I understand now why the finances were in the shape they were when we got the government.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of TIR. Mr. Speaker, back in August, the Premier made it clear that the Liberal government was seeking federal money to help fund the ferry services between Yarmouth and Maine. The Premier said, and I quote, "This is an international link. This is Canada's link to the eastern seaboard. We want the federal government to be part of that, helping us ensure that the service is there for the long run." And Mr. Speaker, I'll table that quote. With the new government in Ottawa and the passing of the new federal budget, it's clear that the provincial government failed to secure federal funds. So my question to the Minister is, given the Premier's apparent commitment to securing federal funding, would the Minister please explain to the House why his government was unsuccessful in getting funding for the ferry?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. The federal government has been engaged very much in the conversations around the Yarmouth Ferry. The member is absolutely right. It is a long-term commitment. We've made that 10-year commitment that we will have that service in place. We'll have a relationship with Bay Ferries, who also, by the way, have a very strong connection with the federal government, Mr. Speaker. We're going to need support. We've had specific discussions on the terminal down in Yarmouth for the Nova Scotia Ferry. We've also had conversations about the long-term, what the vessel, what the model, what the entire system will look like. So, Mr. Speaker, without question, we've had tremendous conversations with Ministers Bryson, Garneau, and Sohi on the Yarmouth Ferry. Those conversations will continue, and Mr. Speaker, we look to have them as a long-term partner as we make sure that Nova Scotia Ferry succeeds here in the province for all the people who enjoy.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on another occasion, the Premier said, and I quote, "This is an international link," said McNeil, "with Canada's largest trading partner. This is the East Coast connection to that, and we believe that the federal government should be there helping us." Now, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians know now that the Liberal government not only failed to secure federal funding for the service, but gave a blank check to Bay Ferries and negotiated away our ability to trade through trucking. So the question is quite simple. Does the Minister and the Premier no longer believe that it is important to provide further opportunities for trade with our largest business partner just to satisfy the City Council in Portland?
I'd like to remind the honourable member not to refer to the Premier with his proper name. The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank you for correcting the member opposite on his mistake there. Mr. Speaker, look, it is an important link. Obviously, the Premier and I, our government, and all this side of the House certainly support that all too important international link with Portland, with the state of Maine, for the province and the people of Nova Scotia. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the trucking, Digby St. John has been that run. They've provided that opportunity for local exports to get out of that region, Mr. Speaker. If there's issues with capacity, again, that's a conversation I've had directly with Minister Garneau. It is a long-term investment. It's a long-term link. We're proud of that relationship. It's important not only for our economy, but specifically for tourism. We're standing behind the region. We're standing behind Nova Scotians. It's a great investment, and our federal partners will be there when we need them. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Speaker, a question for the Minister of Justice. Boots on the Street, a program that was announced first in 2007, put an additional 150 police officers to work in our communities to reduce crime and improve public safety. Now, I happen to notice in the Finance Minister's budget address today that there was no mention of this program. Mr. Speaker, it was obviously not something the government wanted to highlight. Will the Minister confirm, the Minister of Justice confirm, that more than $500,000 has been cut from this program?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think the first point for the House to recognize is that the budget item for that is $16.2 million, which is a significant commitment to that program in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, I should have had my earpiece in because the Minister's comments, so I didn't quite hear what she said. Perhaps she's confirming that there's not been a cut. But I will proceed since I didn't hear. The Boots on the Street program, Mr. Speaker, this was an effective program that was applauded by many groups, community groups, that work with a mandate of public safety. And we know many communities where it has helped and provided peace of mind for many Nova Scotians. Will the Minister tell the House here today how many police officers will be taken off our streets with today's budget?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I just because you missed the first answer, I said we have $16.2 million in the budget for this additional police program. So it's still a significant contribution, a large amount. The amount has gone down. So to give you a more fulsome answer, it is down by about $500,000. And what we're doing is reviewing the program after 10 years of its operating to see how we can make it sustainable, make it perhaps more robust, make it more effective for the policing in the province. And before I sit down, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important to note that when it was introduced 10 years ago, it was actually at a time when we had the highest violent crime in the country in our cities. We now are at the national average. We also were below the national average in the number of police per capita at that time. We are now above the national average. So the situation is different 10 years later, and it's time for a review.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on April 18th, just days after a lively protest on the steps of the legislature, the Minister of Environment chose to dismiss 4 of 6 appeals to the approval she gave to the Alton gas project. Mr. Speaker, there are very real concerns by our First Nations people and many others about pumping billions of litres of brine into the Shubenacadie River, and that this could cause irreparable harm to the river, the fish, including the striped bass, which is an endangered species, and the fish habitat. So my question for the Minister, I'm very curious, Mr. Speaker, when making her decision to dismiss these appeals, has the Minister applied the precautionary principle as required by the Environment Act to this issue?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite. As she informed the House on Monday, I ruled on 4 appeals on the Alton gas industrial approval, and all of those appeals had different grounds and a different basis. So I gathered all the information was gathered, presented to me to look over and to make an assessment on that. So I felt that I was very well equipped. I had a lot of scientific information about the brine going in the river and the risk to the fish population there. I also had a lot of information about the consultation process and what had happened, and I was very happy with the information that I had that I could rule and turn down the appeals.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I don't think she exactly answered my question about whether she used the precautionary principle. And one thing we do know is that this has never been done before by this company in any country, including Canada. They've never put the brine into the river, so we don't know what the outcome will be. But the appeals that were submitted on Alton Gas also address this lack of consultation with the communities on the ground in close proximity. So they are very very, very concerned, and they've held community meetings, organized peaceful protests, submitted petitions and written letters on the issue. So my second question is, would the minister engage in meaningful consultation with the nearby communities of Sipanigadik and Millbrook First Nations, as well as non-Aboriginal residents, with me in the near future who are directly affected by this project?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the members opposite. The Sipanigadik Band is from Sipanigadik, and certainly I've been familiar with the band. I'm the MLA also for Anse East, and their MLA. I still have 2 more appeals to rule on. That will be done next Monday or sooner. The deadline date is next Monday. After that time, I would be happy to meet with the bands, both bands involved, Sipanigadik Band, and Indian and Millbrook at any time, and certainly I'd be able to do that. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question to you will be also to the Minister of TIR. Mr. Speaker, in his last answer, the Minister said that the trucking industry could use the Digby-St. John ferry. Recently, I had an opportunity to be in Pubnico, and I met with some trucking companies there, and at that time, the people that operate the trucking outfit said that the ferry in Digby-St. John was not conducive for what they needed to do. As a matter of fact, he said that the ferry was not developed for Canadian trucking standards. It was more for a European standard. So I would like the Minister to respond to the question as to why is it that we are not allowed to send ships through Yarmouth to Portland? Trucks, I meant.
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The City of Portland, it's twofold. There's a significant amount of investment that they would be required for U.S. Customs in a very large number to have that facility there to intake trucks. Also, there's issues of congestion and related challenges in the City of Portland with those vessels, but with the trucks. Sorry, but
order, please. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call government notices of motion?
We'll now call government notices of motion.
Would you please call resolution number 3128?
We'll now have resolution number 3128. The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to stand and talk to this resolution, not so much of what it does, but of course what it does not do. As we all know, the position of Deputy Speaker is crucial to the smooth running of this House Assembly. And as members know, and as you do too, Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Speaker takes the chair when the Speaker is absent and performs all the duties of that Speaker. As such, it is a position that commands great respect in this House. When you put those robes on and sit in that chair, you have all